At 9:10 on an April morning in 1948, an auctioneer held up an egg so thin his thumb left a dent in the shell. There were 720 more just like it, packed in splintered crates behind a failing poultry barn, cracked, warped, chalky at the ends. He asked if anyone would give him $1 for the lot. Mara Bell raised her hand and said $3.10. The men along the rail laughed. By July, those same men would be standing at her gate, asking why her hens were laying the only eggs in Merrill County that did not break in their hands. But that morning, all they saw was a 41-year-old woman paying real money for garbage. The sale was being held at the Pritchard place outside Alder Creek, Arkansas. Lester Pritchard had spent 15 years building one of the largest laying flocks in the county. Then, over the course of a single winter, his eggs began failing faster than he could sell them. Some cracked in the nest, some collapsed under the weight of the hen. Others looked sound until a customer lifted one from the carton and felt the shell give way between two fingers. By spring, Lester owed the feed cooperative more than the flock was worth. So the wagon went first, then the brooders, then the galvanized waterers and 2 rows of nesting boxes. The eggs were saved for last because nobody considered them merchandise. They were evidence of failure. Mara knew that was exactly why she wanted them. Roy Bledsoe, who owned the biggest hatchery in Alder Creek, called across the yard as she counted out her coins. Planning to build a house out of eggshells, Mara. She did not answer. Mara had learned a long time ago that a crowd rarely laughed because it understood something. Most of the time, it laughed because understanding would take longer than mockery. She loaded the crates into the bed of her half-ton Ford, braced them with feed sacks, and drove 6 miles east to the Bell farm. Her place was smaller than the Pritchard operation. 48 acres, a weathered white farmhouse, a smokehouse leaning slightly toward the orchard, and 52 laying hens that had begun showing the same trouble. Mara had already lost nearly 1 basket in 5 to hairline cracks. She had changed bedding, scrubbed the water pans, checked for mites, bought the supplement the cooperative recommended. Nothing helped. The feed salesman told her the birds were old. They were not. Roy Bledsoe told her small flocks always produced uneven results. They did not. The county agent suggested replacing the hens and starting fresh. Mara could not afford to replace them, and underneath every explanation, she kept hearing her mother's voice. Not the words exactly, the sound of them. Ada Bell had never trusted a perfect-looking answer that arrived in a printed sack. When Mara was 13, her mother had shown her how to hold an egg in front of a lamp and read the shell before looking at what was inside. A healthy shell did not merely look white. It carried weight. It had an even grain. Under light, it did not show pale bands where the hen had run out of mineral before dawn. Breakage tells you where the weakness is, Ada used to say, and weakness tells you what arrived too late. At the time, Mara thought her mother was talking about eggs. Years later, she understood that Ada rarely talked about only one thing. That first night, Mara carried all 720 eggs into the kitchen. She covered the table with flour sacks, lit 2 lamps, and began sorting. She did not separate the eggs into good and bad. They were all bad. Instead, she separated them by the way they had failed. Star cracks at the narrow end, long fractures around the middle, soft patches near the air cell, shells that flaked like old paint. She broke open a sample from each crate, rinsed the fragments, and set them on labeled saucers to dry. By 2 in the morning, a pattern had appeared. The damage was not random. Again and again, the shells were weakest in a pale band near the widest part of the egg. The same place, the same thinness, the same late-stage failure. Whatever was happening to Lester Pritchard's hens was happening while the shell was being finished. And Mara's hens were showing the same mark. The next morning, She went to the small shed behind the smokehouse where her mother had once kept feed tools. Most of it had been cleared after Ada died, but one thing remained on a nail beside the door. A wooden scoop with 2 notches cut into the handle. Mara remembered those notches. One measured fine limestone, the other measured coarse oyster shell. Ada had never mixed them together. The fine mineral went into the morning mash. The coarse shell went out near sundown, scattered where the hens would take it slowly before roosting. The modern supplement Mara had been buying was different. It was a soft gray powder, all one texture, fine enough to hang in the air when she opened the sack. The label promised complete mineral balance. The egg said otherwise. Mara spent the next 2 days searching the attic, the pantry, and the old desk in the front room for her mother's notes. She found tax receipts, seed catalogs, a bundle of Christmas cards tied with blue ribbon, no feed records, so she rebuilt the method from memory. She divided her flock into 2 pens of 26 hens each. The first group stayed on the cooperative supplement. The second received fine limestone in the morning and coarse oyster shell in the late afternoon. Measured with Ada's notched scoop, everything else stayed the same. Same grain, same water, same bedding, same hours outside. Mara marked every egg with the date and the pen number. Then she waited. In a small town, unusual work never stays private for long. By the end of the week, Roy Bledsoe had heard that Mara was weighing eggs in her kitchen and feeding her hens by the clock. At the feed store, he told 2 farmers she was trying to cure bad layers with moonlight arithmetic. The phrase traveled faster than the truth. Mara heard it from the woman who delivered her kerosene. She kept her records anyway. For the first 9 days, nothing changed. The eggs from both pens cracked at nearly the same rate. On day 12, the treated pen produced 3 eggs with heavier shells. On day 16, 5. On day 21, Mara dropped an egg from each pen onto a folded towel from the same height. The control egg split along the pale band. The treated egg bounced once and rolled against the flour bin. It was not proof, but it was enough to keep going. That was when Ira Boone came to the farm. Ira had served as Marrow County's agricultural agent for 27 years before retiring with a bad hip and a reputation for giving answers nobody enjoyed hearing. He had known Ada Bell. More importantly, he had argued with her. He arrived in a brown sedan, climbed out with a cane in one hand and a narrow wooden box in the other, and asked Mara to show him the eggs. Inside the box was a spring scale, a micrometer, and a pair of calipers from the extension office. Mara asked whether the office had sent him. "No," he said. "The office thinks your hens are old." He looked toward the 2 pens. "I think old hens are being blamed for something new." For the next month, Ira came every Tuesday and Friday. He measured shell thickness at 3 points. He weighed dried shell samples. He recorded breakage during handling. He insisted on writing down failures as carefully as successes. "Memory is loyal to hope," he told Mara. "Paper is not." By the 31st day, the difference could no longer be dismissed. Eggs from the treated hens had thicker, more even shells. Their breakage rate had fallen by more than half. The control group kept getting worse. Ira studied the figures at Mara's kitchen table and tapped one column with a blunt fingernail. "The total calcium may be the same," he said, "but the bird is not receiving it the same way." The fine powder moved through quickly. The coarse shell remained available longer, especially during the night, when much of the shell was being formed. Ada's method was not a secret ingredient. It was a question of timing. And timing was exactly what the printed label did not mention. Mara wanted to take the results to the county office. Ira told her to wait. Not because he doubted the numbers, because one flock was still one flock. They needed more time, more eggs, and a reason the office could not dismiss as a farm woman's memory. That reason arrived before they were ready. In the 3rd week of June, Heat settled over Merrill County and did not move. Hens panted in the shade, water pans warmed by noon. Then the first hatchery called the extension office. Its hatch rate had dropped by a third. 2 days later, another hatchery reported chicks dying before they could clear the shell. The shells were too weak to protect them during development, yet the surviving membranes dried tight around the chicks. By the end of the week, 4 counties were reporting the same pattern: cracked table eggs, collapsed nests, failed hatches, breeding flocks that looked healthy but could no longer produce reliable shells. Roy Bledsoe lost 6 incubator trays in 9 days. More than half the chicks he expected never emerged. He blamed the heat. Then he blamed a respiratory illness. Then he blamed the farmers who supplied his hatching eggs. He did not blame the supplement because the sacks said complete. That word had become a kind of shield: complete, balanced, tested. Every farm had trusted the same promise. And now every farm was failing in the same way. The cooperative ran out of replacement mineral mix in 2 days. Egg prices doubled. Families began saving cartons because there were not enough sound eggs to fill them. The county office sent notices advising farmers to cull older hens and reduce stress. Mara read the notice twice. Then she walked to the control pen. 9 eggs lay in the nests. 4 were cracked. 1 had collapsed so completely that the hen was standing in yolk. For the first time, Mara wondered whether she had waited too long. She moved every bird onto Ada's schedule that evening. There was no control group anymore. There was only the flock, and the possibility that she might be wrong before the county discovered she had ever believed she was right. The next 10 days were the hardest of the summer. Improvement did not come all at once. Some shells still failed. 2 hens stopped laying. 1 became weak and had to be separated. Mara slept in short stretches, waking before dawn to check nests and again at dusk to scatter the coarse shell. Ira kept records at the kitchen table, while sweat darkened the back of his shirt. Neither of them said the word crisis. They did not need to. Then slowly the breakage line began to fall, not to 0, but low enough to matter. Out of the next 60 eggs, 53 reached the kitchen intact. At Roy Bledsoe's hatchery, barely 4 in 10 did. The difference moved through Alder Creek faster than the earlier jokes. The first farmer came to Mara's gate before breakfast. The second arrived before noon. By evening, 5 trucks were parked along the road. The men who had laughed at the auction stood with their hats in their hands, looking past Mara toward the hens scratching under the mulberry trees. Roy Bledsoe was not among them. Not yet. Mara did not make a speech. She brought out Ada's notched scoop. She showed them the 2 particle sizes. She explained the timing. Morning for the fine mineral. Late afternoon for the coarse shell. She told them exactly how she had divided the flock, and exactly how long it had taken to see a change. She also told them what she did not know. She did not know whether every flock would respond the same way. She did not know whether the supplement was deficient, contaminated, or simply made in a form the birds were not using well. She knew only what the shells had shown. That honesty did more than certainty would have. Within a week, 12 farms had begun small trials. Ira collected their records. The results were not identical, but the direction was. Flocks receiving the coarse evening shell produced fewer thin-banded eggs. Breakage dropped. Hatchery suppliers began recovering first. That was when the State College sent Dr. Helen Ward to Alder Creek. Helen was a poultry nutrition researcher with short gray hair, round spectacles, and the habit of asking a question twice in 2 different ways. She spent an afternoon at the Bell farm. She examined Mara's records. She opened bags from the cooperative. She compared the powder under a magnifying lens with coarse shell from Mara's bin. Then she asked to see the 720 auction eggs. Mara had saved the labeled shell fragments in shallow wooden trays. Helen moved from tray to tray without speaking. Finally, she held one piece toward the window. "This is not damage from handling," she said. "No," Mara answered. "It was built weak." The state laboratory confirmed the larger problem 2 weeks later. The regional feed mill had changed its grinding process during the winter. The mineral percentage printed on the label had not changed, but the physical form had. Nearly all the calcium source had been reduced to a uniform dust. On paper, the feed still met the formula. Inside the hen, it did not remain available long enough during the hours when the shell needed it most. The crisis had not begun because farmers failed to follow instructions. It had begun because everyone trusted a number without asking how the bird actually used it. The broken eggs had asked that question first. Helen wanted to know where Ada Bell had learned the two-stage method. Mara could not answer. She knew only that her mother had used it for years, and that once, when Mara was a girl, Ada had taken a thick envelope to the county office and returned home with the envelope unopened in her lap. Ira remembered the visit, not the details. Only Ada standing at the counter while an older agent told her the office could not evaluate every household poultry notion brought in from the countryside. The next morning, Ira unlocked a storage room behind the extension office. He and Helen spent 6 hours opening warped file drawers that had not been touched since before the war. Near sunset, inside a folder marked Woman Farm Notes, they found a carbon copy of Ada Bell's submission from 1926. It contained 9 years of records, laying seasons, weather notes, shell failures, feed ratios, times of day. Ada had tested fine and coarse minerals separately long before commercial complete supplements reached every farm in the county. She had even drawn the same pale band Mara had found in the Pritchard eggs. Clipped to the front was the office reply. It thanked Mrs. Bell for her interest. Then it advised her to leave feed formulation to trained men. Ira read that sentence in the storage room and removed his glasses. For a long time he said nothing. He had not written the letter, but he had spent most of his life inside the office that kept it. Finally he looked at Helen. "We filed the proof," he said, "under the person we refused to hear." Helen carried the folder to Mara's farm that evening. The records had not been lost. They had been categorized out of importance. And now the broken eggs had forced the county to read them again. By September, the college had completed controlled trials. The evening coarse shell method improved shell consistency across multiple flocks, especially during heat stress and in older layers. The feed mill changed its process. The cooperative replaced the affected sacks, and the State Extension Service issued a bulletin explaining that mineral form and feeding time could matter as much as the percentage printed on the tag. At Mara's insistence, the bulletin credited Ada Bell's farm records as the earliest documented fieldwork behind the recommendation. It also named Mara Bell and Ira Boone for the county trials that brought the problem to light. Roy Bledsoe came to the farm 3 days after the bulletin arrived. He parked beside the same truck Mara had used at the auction. For a moment he stood near the gate as if he expected someone else to speak first. Then he said he had lost 57% of his summer hatch. He said the new feeding schedule had saved enough of his breeding flock to keep the hatchery open. He looked toward the barn. "I was wrong about those eggs," he said. Mara waited. Roy cleared his throat. "And about you." It was not an elegant apology, but it was an honest one. Mara accepted it the same way she had accepted the laughter, without making it larger than the worker. By the following spring, 38 farms in 4 counties were using some version of the two-stage mineral schedule. The numbers varied by flock, season, and feed, but the lesson held. A formula could be correct and still fail in practice. A label could tell the truth and still leave out the part that mattered. and knowledge did not become worthless simply because the wrong person had been holding it. Mara kept the 720 shells for years, not all of them, only the labeled samples. They remained in shallow trays in the shed, beside Ada's notched scoop and the copied extension bulletin. When young farmers came to ask about feed, Mara did not begin with the recipe. She handed them a broken shell. She asked where it was thin. She asked when the weakness had formed. She asked what the bird had needed at that hour. Because Ada had been right. Breakage told you where the weakness was, and weakness told you what had arrived too late. The feed sacks had carried the promise. The broken eggs had carried the proof.